My ex-wife traded in her husband and kids for what she called an upgrade. A man I'll call Mr. Moneybags, complete with shiny toys and a luxury lifestyle to match. She walked out chasing that so-called better future without looking back at the family she left behind. Years later, she suddenly reappeared with a wedding announcement. Not because she missed us, but because she wanted the kids standing in her photos. And of course, she didn't come empty-handed. She showed up loaded with designer gifts, like love could be swiped on a credit card. But before all that, the cracks had already started to show. The cracks begin to show. From the outside, our marriage still looked fine. Family pictures showed smiles, holidays looked normal enough, and for a while I convinced myself that what other people saw matched reality. On the surface, we looked like a steady family, but that picture started to slip. Things didn't fall apart in one big argument. It was a slow process, a series of small changes that added up to something I couldn't keep ignoring. The first shift came when she started coming home later than usual. At the beginning, her reasons sounded believable. Late meetings, big projects, deadlines piling up. I wanted to take her words as truth because that was easier than questioning them. But as the weeks passed, the explanations kept piling on and they didn't really line up. One night, it was a client issue. The next, it was an unexpected meeting, and then another unexplained delay. Each story alone might have made sense, but stacked together, they felt flimsy. Then the phone habits changed. Before, she used to leave it sitting on the table without a thought. Suddenly, the phone never left her hand. If a call came in, she left the room. At first, just stepping into the kitchen, but eventually walking down the hall and then outside. Conversations once held in front of all of us now happened behind closed doors. That shift wasn't subtle, and it didn't escape the kids either. The secrecy became part of the atmosphere at home, a quiet signal that something was being hidden. Whenever I asked, the answer was always the same: work stress. She said it so often that it lost meaning. One day it was stress from a project, the next from management, and another day from some office reshuffling. It was a catch-all phrase she leaned on every time questions came up. If her workplace was really that chaotic, you'd think it would have made the news. Even I started to realize the excuses sounded less like real explanations and more like cover stories stacked one on top of another. The changes didn't just affect me. They shifted the energy in the entire house. Carter, who was 14 at the time, had always been talkative at dinner, but he grew quiet, pushing food around his plate when his mom didn't show up again. He was old enough to connect the dots, even when he didn't say much about it. Charlotte, only 11 then, asked questions in a softer way. She wanted to know why her mother wasn't home, why she missed dinner, why she was absent more often than not. Kids notice the gaps adults try so hard to patch over, and they don't usually buy explanations that don't add up. I wanted to shield them, so I stuck to easy answers. I told them their mom was just busy, tired, caught up at work. I believed part of it too, or at least I wanted to. Blaming long hours and stress was more comfortable than facing the idea that our marriage was unraveling. By repeating those excuses, I ended up sounding rehearsed, almost mechanical. Like I was handing out a script I barely believed myself. Carter saw right through it. His face gave it away every time she fed us another reason for being gone. Charlotte, young as she was, cut even deeper when she asked if her mom didn't like eating dinner with us anymore. She wasn't being cruel, she was just speaking the simplest truth she could see. The silence around all of it was what really settled in. Meals weren't the same. Weekends felt strained. Even when no one argued, the house felt weighed down. Quiet suspicion filled the spaces where laughter used to be. I thought that if I kept pretending things were normal, I was protecting the kids. What I didn't realize then was that they were learning to read between the lines faster than I could cover them up. The cracks in our family life weren't hidden anymore. They stretched wider every day, showing up in empty seats at dinner, half-truth excuses, and a phone constantly carried into another room. My kids noticed, and I did too. I just wasn't ready to admit what I already suspected. What I told myself was work stress was clearly something else. And eventually, the gap wasn't filled by late meetings or deadlines. It was filled by another person. The truth wasn't about stress at all, and it was only a matter of time before that became impossible to ignore. What none of us knew then was that the man stepping into that gap would change everything. Enter Mr. Moneybags. So this is where everything became clear. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the dodged questions, it wasn't about work. It was about a man. And not just any man. He was polished in a way that made it obvious he lived in a completely different world than we did. From the expensive suit to the kind of watch you'd never see in a department store, he looked like wealth had been stitched into his skin. The first time I heard his name, I couldn't shake the nickname that instantly came to mind, Mr. Moneybags. It fit too well. My ex didn't describe him as a mistake or lapse in judgment. She presented him as if she were announcing a new career, like this was some bold move toward progress. She used phrases like security and opportunities as if choosing him meant unlocking a better future. It was as if she wanted us to view this man as an upgrade, trading in the family she had for something flashier, like swapping out a car for the latest model. The problem was, what she was trading wasn't a product. It was us. The reality unfolded harshly in our own home. Carter was 14. He had already picked up on the tension, the secrecy, and the late nights. He didn't need a carefully worded explanation. He pieced things together on his own, and once it fell into place, the reaction was immediate. He shouted, cracked between disbelief and fury, then stormed out of the house before any response could be given. That was the breaking point for him. He wasn't just angry at her decision, he was furious at the idea that anyone would expect him to accept it. Charlotte was 11, and her way of processing it couldn't have been more different. She didn't yell. She didn't slam the door. She quietly clung to me as if holding on could stop the change from happening. Her silence was louder than Carter's outrage. It was the fear of being left behind that showed in her grip around my arm. She couldn't find the words for the questions in her eyes, but the truth was written across her face. She felt abandoned, and no explanation could soften that. My ex never saw those exact reactions. She was too focused on positioning her choice as a positive, almost like she was reciting slogans from a seminar. Pursuing happiness, seeking fulfillment, those were the lines she leaned on. But in our living room, these words didn't land. Nobody was buying it. The kids weren't hearing a message about growth. They were seeing the reality of losing their mother to a man who just happened to have more money. Carter refused to let her statements slide by. His anger cut through, and almost immediately he gave the situation its label. He didn't call the man by his actual name. He called him Mr. Moneybags. That one word carried his disgust, frustration, and bitter sense of humor all at once. It was his way of making the truth plain. It wasn't about love, it was about money. That nickname stuck the moment it left his mouth, and from then on, that's exactly who the man was in our family's eyes. The nickname wasn't a joke at first. It came from pain. Hearing Carter say it, that bitter, sharp laugh under his breath, was harder than the shouting. It was his way of mocking the entire idea that wealth could replace what he had lost. And what hurt even more was watching Charlotte pick it up in her quiet way. She eventually repeated it without anger, almost like she was giving a name to the disruption in her life. For her, calling him Mr. Moneybags was a way of sorting him into a category. Not family, not friend, but the outsider who broke things. Meanwhile, their mother continued to insist she was making the right choice. She described it as stability. She painted visions of houses, trips, and luxurious futures. But those promises weren't meant for the kids she was leaving behind. They were projections, a sales pitch layered with dreams that didn't include the three of us. She truly believed she was trading up, but in her home, the contrast between her promises and our reality was impossible to ignore. Carter, in his bitter teenage clarity, dismissed every word. He judged the whole thing in seconds and finalized the verdict with that single nickname. Charlotte, more quietly, decided with her silence. The painful truth was clear. Her kids would never see this man as what their mother wanted him to be. They didn't view him as a savior, or even as a meaningful presence. He had entered their lives not by bringing something in, but by taking someone away. In their hearts, he wasn't a partner. He was just a symbol of the money, the vanity, and the betrayal. From that point forward, the nickname echoed in everything. It blurred out her explanations and overshadowed her speeches about growth. No matter what she said, no matter how much she tried to rationalize the decision, they had branded him permanently. To them, he wasn't a future. He wasn't even a possibility. He was just Mr. Moneybags. And nothing she said could change that. That was the real turning point. Not when she hid phone calls, not when she slipped away at night. This moment when her children made up their minds was the true collapse. Her carefully built arguments fell apart in seconds. What stuck, instead, was the judgment of two kids who saw the truth for what it was and named it with a single, stinging label. And once that name existed, it lived with us. It was the filter through which they understood her decision. It was the symbol of the choice she had made. And it was the reminder that in their eyes, the man she chose was never going to matter. Not as family, not as support, not as love. Just as the final word of what she walked away for. It was only after that name stuck that she made her next move. The disappearing act. When she finally said it out loud, it wasn't filled with hesitation or guilt. It landed clean, like she had been rehearsing the line in a mirror for months. One day, she was still half in our daily life, helping with the occasional dinner or school form, and the next, she was gone. Bags packed. A new phone number sent with no warmth. Her life redirected into the shiny orbit of Mr. Moneybags. There wasn't a slow drift. It was a complete exit. She explained it with two words that still ring in my ears: seeking happiness. She spoke them with the kind of steady confidence people use in self-help seminars or Instagram captions under filtered sunsets. In her vocabulary, happiness wasn't about family or quiet evenings with the kids. It translated into luxury condos, new wardrobes, and high-end dinners. Fulfillment, as she painted it, wasn't at our dinner table. It was stitched into designer purses and five-star trips. She called it a fresh start. To me, it was just a convenient label on top of abandonment. Carter cut her off faster than she ever could have imagined. The moment he saw through her choice, he blocked her completely. No texts, no calls. He cut the cord digitally as firmly as he had already cut it emotionally. Messages went nowhere. She became a ghost in his world by his own deliberate choice. For Charlotte, it was quieter but no less real. She erased her mom from her online spaces, one app at a time, deleting messages, unfriending, making sure nothing from her mother could spill into her daily life. For both of them, silence was not just avoidance. It was a boundary. What shocked me most wasn't only that she left, but the ease with which she walked away from being present in our lives. With her gone, everything doubled for me overnight. Getting the kids to school, juggling my job, handling school projects, making dinners, every duty she had once shared, even the smaller unspoken ones, now landed on my list. The details stacked quickly. Carter's math homework, Charlotte's bedtime routine, packed lunches before work, and the late-night moments when both kids needed comfort I didn't exactly know how to provide. Parenting had never been simple, but with one parent absent, every detail was magnified. I tried to fill every role: chauffeur, chef, tutor, comforter, all while keeping up with a full-time job. Some days, it worked. Other days, it felt like standing in a storm and juggling with numb fingers. Even so, we didn't collapse. The kids saw me holding the family together, not perfectly, but steadily. They saw that I stayed even when it wasn't easy. As exhausted as I was, those long nights were proof that love doesn't vanish just because life gets messy. For all the exhaustion, there were moments of surprising closeness, too. We made small, imperfect memories. Pizza eaten off the couch on a Friday night, cereal for dinner when everything else went wrong, ice cream straight from the carton, just to end a hard day with laughter. Little things became anchors. Those weren't glamorous evenings, but they built a bond stronger than anything money could buy. In a way, that messy household became a refuge, a place where nobody questioned whether love was still in the room. Meanwhile, her messages, though they rarely reached me, were still dressed in the same glossy justification as the day she left. Words about growth, renewal, finding purpose. She seemed convinced that one day Carter and Charlotte would understand, that they'd look back and see it as brave. Maybe she imagined they'd applaud her for chasing a dream life. But that imagined reunion was never going to come. For two kids who already knew what it was like to live without her, every message read as empty, another reminder that her promises had always been for herself. Her absence carved different paths in each of them. Carter's mistrust grew harder, almost protective, as if he had sworn that no one would let him down like that again. Charlotte's quietness deepened. She grew cautious with her trust, slow to hand it out, careful in ways a child shouldn't have to be. They both carried the stamp of what had happened, even if they carried it differently. And no new handbag, no sparkling vacation post could soften what her leaving had left behind. She told herself she had begun anew, that she was living courageously, stripped of obligations tying her to a smaller life. For us, there was no such illusion. Her new life looked like a rotation of luxury restaurants, shopping sprees, and carefully chosen outfits. We were left with schedules, chores, long days, and longer nights. She had sought her version of happiness, but we found something sturdier, the resilience to keep going, together. The truth is, the three of us learned to shape a new rhythm. Not flawless, not polished, but real. Yes, I was overworked and worn thin, but we still laughed, fought, and carried on. Being the one who stayed turned out to be more important than trying to replace what had left. The kids experienced firsthand that commitment isn't in the words someone says, but in the presence that never disappears. Time passed. Months turned into years. The distance between us and her widened until she was little more than pictures on social media feeds, images of yachts, resorts, shopping trips, always curated for effect. For Carter and Charlotte, those photos weren't tempting. They were proof that their mother had chosen herself. No caption could change that fact. Through it all, our little household held steady in its own messy strength. The kids grew their way through birthdays, school projects, small milestones. We found moments of joy without needing a polished picture for validation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. And for them, that was enough. But then, after years of near silence, she appeared again. Not with phone calls to talk things through, not with an apology for the past. Wedding bells, guilt gifts. It had been years of quiet distance when her name showed up again. Not in a phone call, but in a message. Simple, direct, almost businesslike. She wrote that she was engaged to be married. No apology tucked into the lines, no attempt at conversation, no mention of birthdays missed or milestones forgotten. Just a statement of fact, wrapped in neat sentences like a press release. She was getting married, and she wanted the kids to take part in the ceremony. There was no pretending her request was about family. She made it clear she expected Carter and Charlotte to be there because, in her mind, her wedding wouldn't look right without them. She didn't say she wanted their company, or that she hoped for reconciliation. The only thing implied was that they'd make her photographs look complete. It wasn't about love or memory. It was about appearances. My children weren't her children anymore. In her eyes, they were pieces in a portrait she wanted to stage. The kids' responses couldn't have been more telling. Carter laughed the minute he read the line about standing at her wedding. It wasn't loud, but sharp, a bitter laugh that left no room for interpretation. He snapped the phone shut and tossed it aside, saying nothing except for a look that said he'd never step foot anywhere near that event. Charlotte, quieter as always, took a different route. She ignored the message completely. Didn't open the attached photos, didn't reply, didn't ask questions about dates or colors. Her silence was deliberate. For her, nothing needed to be said. Then, as if she could sweeten the deal, she reappeared in person. She arrived carrying bags as though she'd been cast in some staged reunion show. Not simple gifts, but glossy, expensive items that screamed recognition, as if silk ribbons could patch over years of absence. Her arms overflowed with high-end shopping bags. Inside were expensive gadgets, watches that sparkled under the light, and even bundles of designer clothes with tags still clinging to them. Glittering items that looked less like presents and more like currency in a bargain she thought she could strike. She was making her sales pitch without needing to say the words. It was hard not to notice how she laid them all out on the table, one after another, in neat little rows like she was stocking a storefront. Her tone matched the gesture, sunny, forced, rehearsed. "These are for you," she said brightly, "because I thought you'd love them." She described in detail where she bought them, how much thought went into selecting the colors and styles, and even slid an envelope of amusement park tickets across the table as if she had remembered who they once were. But what stuck out wasn't her effort, it was her panic. It was written in the rush of her words, in the way she couldn't sit still, in the fake smiles that cracked every time silence fell heavier than she expected. She wasn't really handing out objects. She was dealing in bribes. Every pair of shoes, every glowing screen, every branded watch carried the same message: if I buy enough, maybe they'll forgive me. But the scales didn't balance. No receipt could compete with the weight of birthdays missed, with the years of tucking themselves into bed without her kiss goodnight, with silence that stretched across entire holidays. Carter knew it instantly. He didn't hide behind politeness, didn't even reach forward to touch the bags. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and let his smirk do the talking. The look in his eyes said he'd seen through the act before she even entered the door. Every flashy label was an insult. Every box pried open was a reminder of how little she actually knew about him now. She rattled off his size, asked if he liked one color over another. He didn't answer. His stare told her all she needed to know. No object in the world could convince him she cared, not anymore. Charlotte's answer was softer, but in many ways more devastating. She watched carefully, eyes drifting from the bags to her mother's face, but never once moved to touch a single item. She folded her hands in her lap and stayed absolutely still, like the objects in front of her carried no meaning at all. That silence weighed more than Carter's glare. Her mother tried to place a bracelet into her palm, tilting her head with a rehearsed look of warmth. Charlotte didn't reach up. She didn't shake her head. She simply let it hang between them until the awkwardness pressed her mother to set it down herself. That wordless refusal carved more distance than any harsh sentence could have. The room thickened with tension that her cheerful voice couldn't cut through. She kept talking, her pace quickening, describing how much thought had gone into these choices. She painted the picture of a parent carefully considering her children's likes and interests, when in reality her absence had stolen her knowledge of who they had become. The gifts weren't chosen with insight. They were chosen with money. The irony was brutal. The woman who once claimed she had left to find happiness and who believed her children would one day understand stood in that living room not as a mother, but as a saleswoman. She was pitching her way back in with packaging she couldn't afford emotionally, only financially. Her desperation made it obvious. Every smile forced wider, every gesture rehearsed sharper, every box gleaming brighter than the last. But my kids didn't buy the pitch. They didn't even bargain. They just sat, unimpressed. Guilt doesn't erase missed moments. Gadgets don't fill emotional gaps. Watches don't repair broken trust. And no amount of shiny wrapping disguises the fact that for years she had chosen not to be here. She didn't understand that affection isn't a product. It's presence. And presence can't be purchased. By the time she shifted the conversation toward her wedding, color themes, dresses, seating charts, the kids had already delivered their verdict. She talked as if she was building momentum toward the grand reveal, but what hung in the air was their rejection. Maybe she couldn't hear it in words, but it surrounded her in silence, wrapped in the dry smirk of her son and the untouched bracelet resting on the table beside her daughter. That afternoon didn't end with joy. It ended with open bags, sitting like props on unused shelves, symbols of a desperate attempt that failed before it started. She wanted accomplices in her ceremony. What she got instead was quiet resistance and the cold sting of children who could no longer be bought. And as she reached for another excuse, prepared to launch into her next pitch, my son finally decided he had heard enough. Savage responses from the kids. Carter was the first to respond. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, and let out a laugh that wasn't one of amusement but of disbelief. His words weren't shouted, and he didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, he delivered the kind of sharp sarcasm that only a teenager could voice without hesitation. He told her flatly that no pair of sneakers, no expensive accessory, no shiny object in a box was going to erase the reality of what she had done. It was his way of saying their bond had been broken years ago, and no price tag could patch that over. The line wasn't an outburst. It was aimed directly at the weak spot in her performance, a reminder that her money couldn't buy its way into a space where trust used to live. The timing made it even harsher. She had just finished chirping about a special surprise she'd picked out for him, her voice bright like she was presenting contestants with prizes. But before the moment could gain any warmth, Carter's sarcasm cut it in half. The reaction hit her like a gong. Her carefully rehearsed smile cracked on contact, stiffening into the kind of grin people wear when they know they've lost control but refuse to let go of the mask. She tried to laugh it off, brushing his remark aside as if it were nothing more than teenage moodiness. But if she thought his glare would soften, she was wrong. He glanced at one of the watches she had set out on the table, tapped the unopened box with his finger, and said the one thing that broke any chance she had left. He pointed out that timepieces didn't repair the moment she chose to abandon her children. That was how clear his rejection was, focused, unflinching, and impossible to spin away. She stumbled over her response, reaching for her script about gifts being a fresh start, about making new memories together. But Carter wasn't listening. He had already written her off with 2 sarcastic blows that dismantled her entire plan. She had expected gratitude, maybe even tears, but what she got instead was a teenager cutting through her illusions with bitter clarity. Charlotte's response came differently, but with just as much force. She didn't make sarcastic comments. She didn't raise her voice or roll her eyes. Instead, she simply sat there in silence, watching. Her attention wasn't fixed on the gifts, but on her mother, her face empty of the excitement her mom clearly expected. When one of the bags was nudged toward her, Charlotte didn't open it. Instead, she calmly slid it back across the table. No loud words, no dramatics. Just a simple, quiet refusal. That alone carried more power than sarcasm ever could. Her mother pressed, tried again with a soft, coaxing tone. She encouraged her to look inside, promising she had picked something perfect. Finally, Charlotte lifted her eyes. Her voice stayed calm, almost too quiet, but it pierced the room far more sharply than shouting ever could. Is this supposed to make me forget? That single question crushed the entire performance. There was no recovery, no brand name, no promise of trips, no luxury purchase that could undo what her words exposed. Forgetting meant erasing years of missed birthdays, years of silence, years of being left to wonder why their mother had walked away. Forgetting wasn't something that came with ribbons and bows. Forgetting wasn't a luxury item you could swipe a card for. What struck me most was how effective my children were as a pair, even though they expressed themselves so differently. Carter was fire, all sarcasm and edge, cutting into her excuses with bitter humor. Charlotte was ice, still and calm, but devastating in her precision. Together, they delivered a rejection stronger than any argument I had ever made on their behalf. She had walked into the room expecting to tip the balance with money. Instead, she faced 2 children who, in their own ways, dismantled every angle of her plan. My son mocked the idea that she could ever buy her way back into their lives. My daughter asked if possessions could erase the pain of her leaving. In combination, their answers cornered her. She couldn't push against sarcasm on one side and quiet heartbreak on the other. There was no opening for her to twist, distract, or regain footing. The air in the room was heavy. No one was confused about where things stood. She kept trying, pulling handbags from their wrapping, talking about trips she wanted to take them on, holding out each item with the hope of sparking interest. But every attempt fell flat. Carter smirked, unimpressed. Charlotte sat still, unmovable. The pile of gifts grew into a monument of failure. Every bright box, a reminder of how completely out of touch she was with who her children had become. The contrast between them made their point sharper. Carter snorted when her excuses slipped back into cliches about stress and circumstances. Charlotte didn't laugh, didn't argue. She just let the silence answer for her. One stabbed with biting sarcasm. The other refused to play along at all. And together, they created a wall she couldn't climb. What stood out most wasn't the cruelty of their responses, because there was no cruelty, really. It was the certainty. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't raw emotion from kids who hadn't thought it through. Their rejections were steady, deliberate, and clear. They weren't angry because I had told them to be. They weren't echoing my words. They made those choices themselves. They saw her actions for what they were, and in their own ways, they acted to protect themselves. By the end of that afternoon, her role was unmistakable. She wasn't a mother reconnecting with her children. She was a stranger offering trinkets at a door that was already firmly locked. Whatever script she had written for herself fell apart under the weight of two young voices telling her the truth she least wanted to hear. It was never about the sneakers, the watches, or the shopping bags. It was about years of absence that no gift could erase. The untouched boxes laying across the table made the silence louder. She had come expecting to build a bridge out of designer goods, but what she found was that her children had already closed the road. Their words, and her inability to answer them, made that clear. Her voice grew thinner as she scrambled to keep up the performance. But no amount of cheerful tones or promises of future vacations could undo what had just happened. The rejection wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was final. Carter's sarcasm burned holes through the illusion. Charlotte's quiet question flattened all that was left. Together, they gave her a truth sharper than anything I could have ever said, and for the first time she had no lines to fall back on. She couldn't spin it, couldn't buy her way out, couldn't pretend anyone in that room believed her story anymore. She had been brought face to face with rejection she didn't expect and silence she couldn't shake. That silence would soon become the most unbearable part, the blame game. When the gifts and smiles failed to sway anyone, her next move came as no surprise. Instead of pausing to reflect, she shifted gears into her most predictable defense, blame. The rejection from her kids wasn't something she could process as the direct result of her own choices. Instead, she turned her frustration on me. "You've turned them against me," she said, her voice firm, as though she had uncovered some shocking secret. She directed it at the kids as much as at me, framing the accusation like a verdict. To her, their cold shoulders and sharp replies couldn't possibly come from their own lived experiences. It had to be manipulation on my part. The logic was familiar. She had leaned on it before, and here it was again, surfacing when nothing else worked. The truth is, there was no grand scheme running behind the scenes. I had never poisoned the kids' minds against their mother, nor had I needed to. Every piece of evidence that shaped their feelings came from her absence. No coaching session could have painted a sharper picture than the reality they lived with. Empty chairs where she should have been, unanswered calls on birthdays. No. Goodnight wishes when they were sick. Those gaps were louder than any words I could have spoken. I didn't raise my voice to defend myself. I didn't fire up with anger. Calmly, I looked at her and said the only thing worth saying. I didn't need to turn them against you. Your actions did that on their own. The quiet words seemed to hang in the room, not as an attack, but as an unshakable truth. Her face tightened, and for a moment, she seemed to miss the point entirely, as though the idea that her actions carried weight on their own was too foreign to grasp. She wanted to believe intention counted more than follow-through. In her world, the act of showing up once, or trying now after years of silence, should have outweighed the fact that she didn't show up when it actually mattered. She wanted credit for appearing, for offering something, for finally deciding to play a role in their lives. But intentions don't erase history, and the kids already knew that better than anyone. Carter leaned back in silence, cutting her explanation off without a word. His crossed arms and steady glare made her excuses look hollow. Charlotte didn't move much either, but she didn't soften the blow by offering her mother any comfort. They weren't children waiting to be swayed. They were teenagers who already understood enough about cause and effect. Watching them sit in their refusal made her words collapse under their own weakness. Accusing me of bitter influence was easier for her than acknowledging the truth, but it carried no weight in that moment. Not with two kids present who didn't need interpretations or stories told to them. They had been there. They had seen the reality unfold while she built a new life elsewhere. Laying the blame on me might have shielded her ego, but it did nothing to repair the broken connection. Trying to pin her kids' rejection on someone else didn't change the facts. Their loyalty hadn't shifted because of whispered words. It shifted because the bond had been neglected until it fell apart. They didn't need me to narrate that. They lived it year by year, milestone by milestone, wondering where she was. Her words lost force as she repeated them, smaller each time. She had walked in certain she could buy back what was gone. She shifted to excuses when that failed. And when those collapsed, she leaned on blame. But every turn met the same wall, two kids who no longer trusted what she said, and a father who had no reason to embellish the truth. The memories were enough. The lesson in that moment was simple and unarguable. Accountability isn't optional. You can't vanish, reappear years later, and expect the burden of responsibility to be spread around to someone else. Carter and Charlotte understood this clearly, even if she didn't. They didn't need me to script their feelings. They were fully capable of reaching their own conclusions. And yet, even after that, she wasn't ready to stop. If blaming me didn't work, she had one thing left to try: promises. Bigger ones. More extravagant ones. Instead of pulling back, she leaned forward into an even grander pitch, convinced that something flashier might succeed where handbags had failed. Big promises, bigger face plants. After all her smaller attempts landed flat, she started scaling up her offers into territory that felt absurd. The handbags hadn't worked, the watches hadn't worked, so suddenly she was talking about European vacations and brand new tech devices like she was unveiling some kind of prize package. It wasn't subtle. Her voice lifted when she described the kind of trips people save years for, painting pictures of landmarks and elaborate meals. Then she pivoted sharply to gadgets, newest phones, consoles, headphones, as if Carter and Charlotte were supposed to leap into her arms just because her offers were bigger than before. It played like a script she had rehearsed. Each item came out in sequence, each vacation described like a commercial, right down to emphasizing how special those experiences could be. What she couldn't seem to grasp was that none of it answered the obvious question. Bigger offers didn't erase the emptiness her absence left behind. And both Carter and Charlotte knew it. Carter was the first to break the silence. He leaned back, stared at her, and asked slowly, "Why did it take so long?" Those words cut through every pitch she'd been layering into the air. They weren't sarcastic. They weren't shouted. They were calm, final, and impossible to charm away. She tried to smooth over the sting by reaching for phrases about fresh starts, second chances, and rebuilding family memories, but the words fell hollow. That one question had already put the spotlight in the one place she didn't want it, the years she chose not to be there. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that no amount of detail about European skylines or upgraded phones filled the gap. Carter didn't need to write anything down to tally what was wrong. He already knew a trip overseas wouldn't undo the games she missed, the days in the hospital when only I showed up, or the birthdays she let pass in silence. Each new promise she added was just another reminder of what she hadn't done when it mattered most. Charlotte's turn came later, but it hit just as hard. She stayed quiet while her mother described vacation plans, listing out cities she'd take them to and moments they could supposedly share. Then Charlotte lifted her head and asked, "Would you have skipped my dance recital if it had been in Europe too?" Her words were simple, almost too soft to catch at first, but they carried all the weight her mother's extravagant promises couldn't. Because nothing highlights the shallowness of overblown offers like one pointed reminder of the smaller moments that actually mattered. Those were the ones lost forever, and no glossy trip brochure could bring them back. Her attempt to push harder only exposed the weakness of her approach. The more she promised, the clearer it became that her idea of showing love was tied to numbers and price tags, not to the steady presence her children had wanted. Each time Carter raised an eyebrow or Charlotte stayed still, it showed that the failure wasn't in the size of the offers, it was in the principle. Watching them stand their ground was both painful and affirming. Painful because you could see how much they had needed her back then. Affirming because they wouldn't let themselves be bought now. Every added layer of her pitch just made the cracks in her reasoning more visible. Carter answered with blunt disbelief. Charlotte answered with questions that got sharper each time, and both carried the same truth. Whether it was Europe, the latest gadgets, or anything beyond, the offers arrived far too late. At one point, she raised her voice, frustrated, insisting she was trying. But effort only means something when it arrives in the right season. You don't get credit for trying to parent after years of leaving the role empty. The kids saw that instantly. Forgiveness wasn't waiting to be unlocked by a bigger promise. It had never been for sale. In the end, she mistook escalation for progress. She thought offering more and spending more meant she was closing the distance. What she was really doing was showing her children exactly how shallow her understanding of them had become. If she had been listening, she would have heard their message clearly. It wasn't about the trips or the gadgets, it never was. By then, the proof was sitting in front of her. The more spectacular the offer, the larger the gap looked between her promises and the moments she'd abandoned. No brochure, no screen, no ticket stub could repair it. Carter kept pushing her with the same unanswerable question. Charlotte exposed the hollowness through her quiet reflections. The result was the same every time, a blunt refusal built on principle, not price. And with the biggest cards already thrown onto the table, there was nowhere left for her to go. She had offered large, but her face plants grew larger. Each rejection clarified what she wanted to avoid, that they weren't refusing because the price wasn't high enough. They were refusing because value meant something she couldn't buy. She didn't give up there, but the direction of her effort shifted. Having failed in private with offers and gifts, she set her sights on appearances instead. The public relations. Her new approach centered on visibility. If winning her children's trust in private wasn't working, she decided to display a version of family life in public, one polished enough to convince outsiders that everything was back on track. Social media became her stage. It wasn't subtle. Posts started appearing with warm captions about family dinners and special bonding nights. The words suggested honesty and closeness, but underneath it had nothing to do with reality. For anyone following online, it looked like a mother finding her way back. For those of us living it, it felt more like being pushed into a stage production. The most vivid example came at a restaurant she referred to as a family dinner, though there was little family in the atmosphere. She reserved a table at a place none of us had a connection to. It wasn't casual or inviting, more of a backdrop selected for presentation and comfort. The moment we sat down, the real motive emerged. It wasn't about food. The attention was on cameras, angles, and the idea of fabricating closeness into a perfect frame. Instead of conversations about school or work, the night was filled with instructions. Sit closer, smile bigger, turn your shoulders for better light. Carter lasted the shortest time. When she leaned in and told him to smile like he meant it, his patience ended. He pushed his chair back sharply, the scrape of wood echoing louder than anything said between us all evening. Calm but cutting, he muttered that he wasn't a prop. Then he walked out, leaving his seat empty and her with a camera still raised in midair. For her, it was a disaster unfolding publicly, the lead image of her campaign dropping out mid-scene. The diners around us noticed, some pretending not to watch. For Carter, leaving wasn't performance. It was relief. Charlotte reacted differently, but with just as much force. While her brother's resistance came with motion, hers appeared in stillness. She stayed in her chair, not touching her plate, her hands folded neatly. Then, when her mother draped an arm around her shoulder for a post-shot, the tears came. Not sudden sobs, just quiet tears streaming as she whispered that she wanted to go home. It wasn't rejection of the meal. It was rejection of the act itself, the sense that the embrace wasn't about her, but about the photograph being planned. That realization weighed heavier than any caption her mother would later write. The photos that made their way online told a different story. Captions painted each evening as joyful, as fresh starts and meaningful reunions. Smiles were framed carefully enough to almost feel convincing. Scrolling quickly, it would have been easy for strangers to believe. But anyone who lingered in the images would notice the stiffness, the half smiles, the eyes pulled toward the exit, the arms that resisted leaning in naturally. Those details told the truth no filter could disguise. And it wasn't just that one dinner. More attempts followed, each designed for its own set of photos. Outings that didn't match the children's interests suddenly became scheduled. Parks were chosen for picturesque settings, not because anyone wanted to be there. Ice cream stops turned strange, with cones held long enough for pictures but melting untouched as conversations went nowhere. Each time, the camera pulled focus before the Bond could. Carter got quicker at signaling his refusal. Instead of sarcastic remarks, sometimes he just left. During one of her repeated quick photo attempts, he cut her words short by standing, tossing his napkin aside, and walking away without explanation. The bluntness of his exits grew into a pattern. To outsiders, his absence never showed. She cropped him out or didn't post at all. To us, those moments were stark reminders that even the attempt to perform closeness gave him reason to detach further. Charlotte broke more softly, but no less painfully. During one picnic she orchestrated, her mother spent so much time shifting blankets and directing postures that the scene became more about camera angles than conversation. Eventually, Charlotte just stopped cooperating. She sat down, folded her arms, and told her flatly she didn't want to pretend anymore. Her tears followed, not loud, but steady. And that was the quiet truth buried under the images that no one wanted to be part of a story that wasn't theirs. Each failed performance made her motive clearer. The actions weren't grounded in wanting to listen, share, or reconnect. They were scripted, aimed at likes and validation from her audience. The energy wasn't in asking her kids about their days or trying to understand their feelings. It was in hashtags tied to words like family and love, words that rang false in practice. She wasn't rebuilding, she was rebranding. The difference landed hardest on Carter and Charlotte because they recognized it instantly. For them, the performances didn't create a sense of being wanted. They created the sense of being used for photos, used for stories, used as props. Carter's sarcasm and departures, Charlotte's tears and refusals, they weren't random reactions. They were defenses against being packaged into a life that didn't actually exist. For me, sitting there and watching, the contradiction was impossible to miss. Brightly lit photos promising reconnection on her feed were matched with stiff, joyless silences in person. Posts, framed with captions about second chances, carried none of the weight of Carter's sharp walkouts or Charlotte's quiet breakdowns. To anyone reading online, she looked like someone making effort. But those of us sitting across the table, standing in parks, or holding untouched ice cream knew the truth. The moments weren't built for us. They were built for applause. Weeks passed with repeated outings in the same pattern. Arranged gatherings ending in her rising frustration and the children's visible rejection. By the end, it didn't matter whether the photograph looked polished. The experience was already fractured in real time. Each event began with intention but collapsed at the point where reality couldn't be disguised anymore. It was impossible for the kids to maintain interest in something designed without them in mind. Eventually, the breaks became permanent. Invitations to more dinners received no response. Family outings, she announced, were ignored. The children learned quickly that they didn't have to play into a scene. They weren't obligated to carry her image forward. Their refusal wasn't rebellious. It was boundaries set in plain view. In the end, the storyline was clearer than any caption. Online images suggested warmth, but the reality was staged, uncomfortable, and thin. The sharpest proof came not from her posts, but from her children's refusals, walkouts, and broken silences. For them, those dinners and photo ops were never reunions. They were reminders of what couldn't be faked. And those reminders were only setting the stage for what came next. Moments where resistance went from quiet refusals to something louder, more direct, and impossible for her to crop out. Grand finale of Rejection. The standoffs and staged outings might have worn themselves thin, but she wasn't finished. What followed was the final act, a bold attempt to force the ending she imagined. Instead of calls or messages, she appeared in person one Saturday morning. She didn't come alone. She brought her mother along, clearly hoping extra reinforcement would tip the balance. It played out like an entrance rehearsed in advance. She stood on the doorstep dressed sharp, her mother beside her, both projecting confidence layered over unease. My kids opened the door to find not just their estranged mother, but also their grandmother called in as backup. Without pause, she launched into the speech she'd been saving. Talk of second chances, blood ties, family unity. The goal was clear, to convince Carter and Charlotte to stand in her wedding. She gestured toward her mother whenever words faltered, and the grandmother repeated familiar refrains. She's still your mother, and one day you'll regret this. The rhythm felt practiced, like lines from a script. Carter was the first to respond, and his choice of words carried more weight than any outburst could have. He looked past his mother entirely and fixed his eyes on his grandmother. In a calm voice he asked, "So when you said it was fine she ditched us, was that supposed to be good parenting too?" The question struck deeper than an argument ever could. It wasn't sarcastic quipping, it was a demand that the enabling finally be acknowledged. Both women froze. The grandmother faltered, the mother tried to dismiss it, but the truth had already landed. Carter wasn't asking for answers, he was naming the flaw that spanned generations. Excuses handed down, responsibility avoided, pain minimized. That one line cracked the performance open more effectively than hours of refusal ever had. His mother tried to salvage it with phrases about mistakes and forgiveness, but the weight of his statement hung heavier than anything she could assemble in reply. Her voice wavered as she pivoted back to pleading for their attendance, almost begging them to consider her side. Carter barely moved. When he finally spoke again, it was simple. He wasn't going to her wedding. No shades of compromise, no softened phrasing. A decision delivered with clarity. Charlotte, who had been quiet through most of it, shifted the ground with her own response. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She looked her mother in the eye and said, "I don't want to be in your pictures. I don't want to pretend I'm in your story." Her words came slow, steady, and final. The silence after was heavier than shouting. She wasn't bargaining for more effort, and she wasn't lashing out. She was closing a door. As her mother reached toward her, Charlotte stepped back, denying any gesture of closeness. It wasn't angry, it was protective. She was making sure the boundary was clear. The grandmother attempted to push harder, layering in the same phrases she had offered earlier about a mother's love and how regret would come back someday. But the kids didn't shift. Their refusal wasn't angry anymore, it was stable, grounded, immovable. They sat there like people hearing a sales pitch for a product they long ago decided they didn't want. For me, this moment became less about the argument across the room and more about what I was witnessing in my children. For years, I had carried the weight of protecting them, explaining away the silences, absorbing the confusion. Now they were speaking for themselves. Carter, calm and sharp, dismantled the enabling. Charlotte, honest and firm, withdrew from the story being written without her consent. Her face tightened, her grip on her designer bag, firming as though it gave her strength. For a moment she looked to her mother, but even the repeated lines sounded empty once spoken against that silence. There was no audience left. What came next wasn't stormy or dramatic. No yelling, no slammed doors. She gathered her things, gestured for her mother, and left. The car engine hummed as it pulled out of the driveway, but inside the house the atmosphere changed instantly. It wasn't celebration, it was release. The cycle of appearances, promises, gifts, and demands had been broken by two voices that refused to bend. The house felt lighter after the door closed. Not joyful, not triumphant, but steady, unburdened. My kids didn't just resist her this time. They finalized the terms. She left knowing where they stood, and they stayed knowing they had chosen themselves over a script that minimized their worth. It was the end of a long pattern, sealed not with anger, but with finality. That clarity mattered more than anything she could have bought or promised. Trust isn't something that comes back wrapped in receipts or tags. Once broken, no collection of gifts or staged dinners can restore it. What my kids showed, clearer than anything else, is that consistency matters more than cosmetics. You either show up as a parent or you live with the consequences of walking away. So here's my ask. If you've ever seen someone try to buy back trust with fancy stuff, or you've got your own small revenge or family drama win, drop it in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Those stories deserve their spotlight too.